Thank you very much for having me back. I can't believe it's already been so long since our last webinar session that we had, where we all talked about these issues, in sort of short order, and that we get the chance to expand that. So looking forward to this as well. I hope this is informative for everybody. Um, this talk is mostly going to be sort of qualitative and a mixture of my own experiences and thoughts, as well as some relevant evidence. The underlying theme, I think, is that we still need more research, even though there's so much research coming out. A lot of it tends to be sort of small scale case studies or case series. And so we want more of these. We want more larger scale studies and prospective studies as much as possible, so that we can better understand how to use these tools in our everyday systematic reviews. I will start off just noting a couple of disclosures. So I am faculty with Cochrane Eyes and Vision. It's always worth mentioning in a talk related to evidence synthesis. I will also note that since 2020, I've been a consultant for Pico Portal on different aspects of the platform. There are some things that I think Pico Portal is really paving the way on when it comes to AI integration, and my involvement over the years has mostly been on suggestions for features and design from the systematic reviewer perspective. It's sort of given me the ability to explore some of the boundaries of AI in reviews, but I'm not going to talk about Pico Portal anymore in this talk. Really, it's just something I should mention because it's relevant to AI and synthesis work. So we all know the systematic review process, so I'm not going to spend any time going over this. Suffice to say, it's expensive, it's human resource intensive, and it always takes far more time than expected every time we begin another one. But because of that, this means there are many different systematic review tasks and places where AI could be incorporated. With more and more studies being done in broad areas, we gain more confidence about its performance and all the different ways it can be incorporated. A big challenge that remains, however, is that large language models, they're not perfectly deterministic, and they're still largely black boxes. So it's hard to benchmark and ensure a consistent result will be achieved in every situation. We also know what exactly is going on behind the scenes. We don't know what exactly is going on behind the scenes. And that makes it also challenging to understand how our prompts will react and what we will get in a response. However, with appropriate training sets and the right prompts, we're seeing more and more capabilities for their use in more than just, say, screening applications, which again is something I'm not actually going to be talking about. I'm focusing for this talk on the writing and synthesis. These studies on the page, are some of the more recent studies that I found on applications of large language models and their utility for systematic reviews and evidence synthesis in general. So sort of talking about all of the different aspects. And in general, I think people have recognized and also revealed the strengths and weaknesses and where more work is needed. Before diving into the meat of my talk, I did want to put this up. I've shown it before when presenting about this topic, and I just think it's interesting and it's a good summary for sort of what is to come. So I asked ChatGPT about its thoughts on its own strengths and weaknesses for evidence synthesis, and it's an interesting self-reflection, and I do agree with it on all of these points. It knows, or probably more aptly, is able to predict based on literature that is digested in its training, that given its own capacity to interpret and work with language, LLMs are most useful in tasks involving language in large volumes of text. I know literature is still expanding, but I do think these are valuable and generally low-hanging fruits for large language models and AI given its current capabilities. I also agree with its own suggested weaknesses. So these are predictive models, and they don't technically understand language, so they don't perfectly get nuances of things like directly making final decisions on assessing quality or biases or providing true interpretation of results. So we can ask AI to find objective answers within text to help us reach conclusions about these things. For example, asking whether a trial describes a randomization process and asking whether the limitations of the study describe any potential biases. But I do not believe these systems are yet really capable of discerning what exactly those objective responses might mean when contextualized to the setting of the study, or to classify the risk of bias and provide the implication of what a conclusion means for practice. I do think these things are possible, and will likely probably be ready sooner rather than later, given the right training data and the pace at which all of these systems are evolving. And then as one more update to that. So a year ago, when I first asked these questions, I asked it again what its strengths and limitations were with the newer 4.5. I've done this sort of throughout this talk to sort of show updates. And the strengths and limitations were similar. This time I also asked what data was it basing those on? Where was it sort of getting those strengths and weaknesses? How was it self-assessing? And, the response is somewhat comforting. We would hope that it would be using existing literature and learning from user interactions and even its own documentation. Of course, a limitation of this is that we don't really know how much of this is actually true versus what it would simply reply because it thinks that's what we want to hear. And for a follow-up, as an example, I asked it for the specific references noted here, and it failed at finding me a relevant Marshall 2023, giving me a Marshall 2019 and apologizing for the mistake. So, if anything, talking with large language models, you should know what to expect. And if you do know what to expect, that can be a good check for where it's helpful. But everything needs to be verified always. And as with, most interactions with LLMs, you win some and you lose some, and you have to be careful about when thinking about which is which. So there's a couple slides that I have with some sort of discussion points and thoughts to keep in mind as we're working through this. I think this might be helpful as well for the discussion at the end. And I wanted to thank Karen Robinson at Hopkins for giving me some bullet points from a previous talk that I did with her on AI integration in evidence synthesis. So these are the kinds of things that, we should be thinking about. What kinds of gains do we see with using AI in general and large language models more specifically? What kinds of potential losses do we have? Where exactly might we find that trade-off in terms of the costs and the benefits? So the costs being not only the financial cost of using the model, but even the environmental cost of running large language models and these very intensive computing systems. How much more gain do we potentially see in terms of the efficiency in reducing the amount of time that humans need to spend versus how much energy it took to generate those responses, right? So there are these kinds of considerations. In this talk, I've already said I'm going to focus on the writing aspect rather than sort of other use cases for large language models, such as screening and data extraction. I'm also focusing on ChatGPT for most of this, just because that's my own experience and that's what I have a subscription for, full disclosure. But there are many LLMs out there with different features and costs, and the supporting literature that I'm sort of covering and presenting for everybody to go out and also look through on their own time in this, they cover a much broader range of large language models than just OpenAI's ChatGPT. So a lot of these have been assessed in the context of what I'm talking about, but in terms of the direct examples that I'll provide from my own experience and uses, that'll just be ChatGPT. And then lastly, sort of also setting up some more discussion questions, some other considerations for this presentation. And again, thanks to Karen for providing these discussion points. What are some of the things you need to see to trust AI results? As more and more literature comes out, will we eventually reach a point where people are okay? Or will there always be sort of a hesitancy and an uncertainty? What are the biggest concerns? How should we evaluate AI? What is the appropriate comparison? And what are the best practices for selection, use, and reporting of AI? What should we do differently? So with that, I'll get into its utility, some of my perspectives, I think, on LLMs and their applicability to writing and synthesis and systematic reviews. So the first area where large language models, I think, have some utility is helping us get started with the drafting of the review protocol itself. Aside from the background, most protocols follow a very structured setup, especially when you're already in a structured environment like RevMan. RevMan is the program used by Cochrane to write their reviews. And even outside of Cochrane, Other people can use Review Manager, sorry, for writing. But even if you're not using that and you are writing your protocol, there's only so many ways that you can, write how you'll do the search, how you'll extract the data, how you'll set up your analysis and your plans for exploring heterogeneity, all of these kinds of things. So having read many, many systematic reviews, you do notice patterns in what people are saying. And so this is one of the areas where I actually don't think I've seen any literature yet. So there's plenty on writing reviews, and we'll get to that and sort of some of the limitations of that as well. But from what I've seen, most papers don't really comment on the protocol. And I think that's a shame. Something maybe would be worth putting something out, because it's incredibly important for the systematic reviewer. You have to follow pre-specified methods. You have to post those protocols, either publishing them or on a preprint server like Open Science Framework or Archive or something like that. And in terms of the potential for use of large language models, it's especially important because AI assistance, in any way that you're using it for your systematic review, it needs to be pre-specified and not ad hoc. So very important to be involved and to be clear in that use in the protocol. So because protocols can be formulaic, I do think there's untapped potential here in asking a large language model to get us started. As all things related to LLMs, what you get out of it will only be as good as what you put into it. So really your prompt. It does help to be an experienced reviewer and methodologist, because you can ask for specific things that will tailor the initial draft to what you want. If I wanted to specify different databases or registries, for example, or add in different additional searching methods, it's easy to put those into the prompt and to explain what you want the system to give you. Being transparent in what you want and what you want to come out of the system, and then how you work with it is also, I think that's a critical step. We'll come back to that and sort of guidelines for use. So that, 2 minutes of writing that couple sentences, what I know, the kinds of things that I want to express in my method section for search development and execution. That's provided me with a good amount of text here that fills all the initial requirements. And this gives me something to edit and clean up as needed. So here's also one of the first examples of a strength of large language models and what it clues into. So how it interpreted that I asked for methods for a systematic review and sort of the literature and whatever it's been trained on. You can see all that I specified initially was the specific databases and working with a librarian, but it knows from its training data and what it would expect and what it would want us to see probably, that it's also added the line about tailoring the search strategies to different databases and making strings with appropriate keywords and medical subject headings. And I hadn't told it to include that. So it's something that is a starting point and should be carefully evaluated to check that it gave everything that I asked it for. But also, this is a good starting point and would have saved me some time. Given how quickly models change, I ran the same prompt again through 4.5 recently, and I found it gave me a less structured and slightly shorter version. I think this speaks to the non-deterministic nature of LLMs, in that you can ask for the same prompt many times, and even if elements and content stays relatively stable, if you're asking for something specific, the body of the text itself can look quite different. But that is also okay. If we're asking it to help us with writing, you don't want it to give, if everybody is asking for the same kind of content, you don't want it to give all of the same text every time. So a next task, an example of something that was harder for the system, was actually generating a search strategy. And from my experience and what I've seen in literature as well, I do think this is still something that should be left almost completely to the librarian or the informationist. If the investigators have extensive training in search generation, then I think that's okay, but they should still involve at least a librarian for peer review of the strategy. Cochrane, requires a librarian's peer review as part of the process, both for protocol and for the actual final publication. I think that's something that more groups and journals should adopt. And I've given a talk about AI integration to a group of librarians, Medical Librarian Association, and they were very involved, and they want to be involved more in the systematic review process. So that is something definitely that I think we should involve them more often. Because searches right now are not that great generally in most systematic reviews. But moving on to what I sort of found from that prompt. So we asked a fairly straightforward question, and the response initially, back in 2023 when we first ran this, it looked like it was okay. There's clearly marked mesh terms and keywords that can be searched in all fields. There's Boolean operators combining terms within a concept with or, and then combining concepts with and. And so it seems like the large language model understood the assignment. However, when you actually try running that in PubMed, that first one, there's some glaring issues with the response. It's because it's predicting relevant terms, and it didn't, at least at that time, have access to the actual mesh database and structure. It was hallucinating mesh terms that didn't exist, or it put in entry terms as mesh, and created a filter for study types that was also unprompted, but also incorrect. And so this is an area where I think the ability of the system to learn and develop with the user's input is useful. We could tell it to use a specific trial filter, give it a set of terms like the Cochrane validated trial filter, and say use this in place of what you already used for trial publication type. And you could tell it that certain mesh terms are incorrect and to replace them with correct ones. So you could iteratively develop the poor search into something better. The search last year when I ran it was certainly a better starting point, to an 85 results and no errors. It's just you might not want to just go with that. You might want to still continue to expand that. But as an initial search, that could be something that could maybe help you find some relevant studies for inclusion that you could then use for further fine-tuning a more comprehensive search. Again, I ran it recently and very similar results to last year. So I'm not sure if OpenAI has been able to get access to the mesh database, and this is why it seems to be a bit better in terms of not hallucinating mesh terms now or as much. But this is just some simple playing around that I've done and not really formal testing. I know there's other LLMs and AI tools available that have been designed to help specifically in searching, but a major problem with most of these tools is that black box nature and not knowing exactly what is being searched or why they do what they do. So this is thankfully one of the areas of LLM research that can be straightforward in comparing what the AI produces to what human experts produce. And thankfully there is a lot of literature out there. There are other people who've done that work, making comparisons between LLM generated searches and librarian expert generated searches. And generally, what they found is in alignment with what I've found, and that is librarians have consistently demonstrated superiority in retrieval performance. The searches that have been generated by humans, and even more recent models like ChatGPT 4.0 or 4.5, those are not performing very well in terms of creating searches for use. They do recognize that there's significant potential for workflow, but there's poor performance in retrieving relevant articles with using just those searches. So the use of LLMs for generating is not yet accurate or really feasible unless you really go in there and workshop the searches, expand on the searches. And as with any research topic, some of these studies and some of the other studies that I'll be showing have been done better than others. That also likely affects the general conclusions. And just again, also to speak to the involvement of librarians, informationists, in multiple webinars that I've given on AI and systematic reviews, some of the most engaged audiences have been the librarians, and rightfully so, because their expertise is not used enough as it is. And there's really a definite danger in making people confident that they're getting good search results easily without the help of a librarian. I think that would be a great mistake if people were to only use large language models to run their search and assume that that's captured everything without having that checked by a librarian. Moving past sort of the search and the initial parts of our protocol, we also have to include in our protocols and our method sections how we're going to go about doing our data extraction, how we're going to do our risk of bias assessments, how we're going to do our analysis. So the methods for this, it is also pretty formulaic. We follow the same general structure. We often include the same kinds of sentences to reviewers independently extracting, right? So because of that, why not try using an LLM to write out the initial draft for you if you can tell it what the structure and what the parts are that you want to include. So it took up again that sort of maybe minute for me to write that prompt, and it's written a nice start to our description. This includes some initial common data extraction items, which is a requirement in Cochrane reviews and can be expanded. I don't believe I asked for that, so that's just something that it thought should be included in that section, and it was right. And then it also recognized, sort of Cochrane risk of bias assessment and put in some additional information about the domains and overall rankings, also something that was sort of unprompted. So this is a great start and can be modified depending on what you need. Once again, the more recent response, it was less structured and included less information. I do suspect that these kinds of general changes that I'm seeing, and maybe others can speak to their experience as well. I think these kind of general changes in terms of producing more succinct responses, it could be from efforts to reduce the overall amount of computing effort and power resources needed for generation overall. If you apply those kinds of broad fixes, which I know a lot of people have been thinking more about, then that will affect all kinds of prompts and what the responses are that you're getting. So that's something to consider. But of course, also given the framework that we have now, if we asked it to elaborate on aspects within this response, so give us some more detail on what each risk of bias domain represents, it would do so, and that would be something that we could then work with and verify. Another example for methods then, moving on to data analysis. So this tends to be the last sort of section within systematic review methods, and this tends to be a bit more specific to the review and less formulaic than other sections of the methods. But again, LLMs, I think, can be useful for getting us started, because if we know what kinds of things we're going to have in our systematic review and what we would expect, the kinds of things that we want to maybe assess in terms of outcomes, right? And maybe how to look for those heterogeneity, we can then have it give it that in the prompt and have it prepare something for us to start. So the text that it gives us to work off of clearly describes how we can begin our qualitative synthesis, and it gives us an accurate overview of assessing clinical, methodological, and statistical heterogeneities, or sort of the differences between there, and some kind of common language that we see in many systematic reviews. It also gives us some suggestions, a starting point for how we might conduct our analysis. So there's also some standard language in here for sensitivity and subgroup analyses, which I didn't ask for. Again, this is sort of its interpretation and its unprompted supplementing what it thinks would be useful to have. But something to note, and this comes from that sort of non-deterministic and also predictive model that is really at the core what LLMs are. Because they are predictive models, common practices that you find in the literature will invariably make their way into the textual descriptions, whether they're good or bad. So there are things in here, we know that we shouldn't select the type of model based on the heterogeneity, but that's something that it's seen in its training data when asked about selecting models, and so it's put that in here. There's two ways around this. Really, we can be more explicit in our guidance when writing our prompt, so we can outline how we want it to specify the choice of model or which specific model we're going to use and only use that model, right? Um, or we can just, of course, carefully examine the text, and we should be carefully examining the text anyways to see what it's given us and edit this as needed. So again, I'm not saying this is something that should be just, my few 5 minutes of prompts, and that's generated a perfect method section for a protocol. But it's generated a start that should be looked at. Another example of an update, as when I ran it again more recently, it was also more compact and less structured to the previous GPT model. So I think there is something there in terms of efforts they're making to reduce the impact, like the environmental impact and financial impact of using these models. So another aspect that is important and sort of gets at after we've got the protocol, after we've done the review, after we've collected our literature and extracted it, we've got it all together, we have to synthesize it, right? And there is the potential, I think, here also for LLMs to help with this. There are a decent number of papers out there that I was able to find talking about talking about LLMs for evidence synthesis and writing. Unfortunately, it's not exactly the kind of studies that I want to see for this. So a lot of these papers are describing different assessments for the LLMs for doing things like generating entire reviews without giving it a set of papers, or providing summaries of a few papers. And so those are not really what I would like to see in terms of assessing the utility of LLMs for writing. So I do think this is an area that there should still be exploration. It could be done, I think, relatively easily with existing data, but it would take a substantial amount of time and human effort, mostly for checking the validity of the synthesis and making the comparisons to what is already out there. So as two examples, we could take existing systematic reviews and compare the results section that humans have already produced to what an LLM produces, given the same data and set of studies, right? That would be sort of a good direct evaluation of synthesis capabilities. Another option or something that could be done would be giving LLM a results section that the humans have drafted, so it's already synthesized, and then comparing the discussion that it generates based on that. So the implications and the limitations and conclusions, comparing those to what the humans have already discussed and written. And those kinds of metrics that I think we would want to look for are things like readability, relevance, mistakes, any factual errors or inferences that are incorrect based on the literature, right? Those are a couple of things that I think could be done and should be done to really test how effective LLMs are for writing. I have not seen those kinds of studies just yet. But there are other smaller ways that we can already, I think, use LLMs in terms of getting started with the writing. So beyond the methods, right? We've done our search. We've got our search results. So describing a search is a paragraph that doesn't really take too long, right? But if you had a general prompt that you could apply and then upload an image, like I've done in this case, you could get that paragraph for any number of reviews, depending on which images you're uploading, which Prisma flowcharts you're putting in, and this is accurate. I think it's also interesting that it actually made some inferences from the flow diagram that I didn't provide and weren't actually in the flow diagram. So, for example, the flow diagram showed 2,208 references after duplicates identified through the database search, and then 9 additional records identified through other sources, and then down to 2,202 records after duplicates have been removed. Because I asked for the number of duplicates and total overall as well, the LLM added those 2,208 and 9 to get 2,217, and then told me 15 duplicates had been removed. So, those details weren't actually in there but it was able to extract that and think about that. And I had asked for the information, so it provided it to me. This text, again, this could be edited into more of a paragraph form for standard approach, but depending on how you have your review written and what your target journal might be, there might be guidance for what they're expecting to see. So you could revise it that way. In terms of actual synthesis then, and starting to digest the information, this is sort of where some of those studies that I've just mentioned have been found in terms of summarizing evidence, summarizing literature, but there's not as much out there in terms of writing actual review. But one of the things that I highlighted, considerations I highlighted in the beginning, was losing the connection to the literature. When we do a review, we really immerse ourselves in the included studies to evaluate them. And I think it's true that if we were able to completely automate or get assistance in the most aspects of getting to this point, I think it's likely that we would have a more shallow understanding of what we have to work with. However, it's also true that being able to reach this point quicker and more efficiently would give us more time to devote to synthesis. So for this task, since prompts are so important, I also clearly noted that I wanted the groups separated for this question based on time, which was an important component for the outcomes, and to include any point estimates where available. So the system, correctly grouped these studies as I requested, and the statements concerning the specified outcome were all correct based on the data that was given to it. A few of the studies didn't have quantitative estimates in the text. They only described quantitative estimates in tables. And so when I did this initially, and I gave it just copied and pasted text from the method's results and discussion, that's why it wasn't able to give me some of these estimates when they actually were there. But I did run this again, feeding just the full text PDFs for these studies, and in those cases, it was able to pull the information that. So it is able to look through the tables and figures as well as the text and pull information. So that is something that is an upgrade from when I had first sort of started looking in this area. And then just a continuation of that, at the longer time point, the study evidence, it was correctly summarized, and the summary overall appropriate suggests the evidence is inconsistent and limited and may not be clinically significant across different populations. So I judge this to be a fair summary given the evidence, and again, not a bad starting point for describing the overall evidence that one might have for an outcome in a review. This could be the first paragraph of your discussion, and then take it from there and expand on that. I know there's also ongoing and recent studies to evaluate GPTs and LLM's ability to help with sort of revising and language. So I wanted to also just check this on my own to see if I could help communicate a complex summary in simpler language. So there's two papers here that have done similar things in looking at plain language summaries. And I took one of my own Cochrane reviews, sort of our original plain language summary on the left, and I asked it to revise it down to 10th grade reading level, and it brought it down further, and smaller as well, so fewer words, better readability. So there is definitely an opportunity there for revising language, particularly I think for readers for whom English is not their first language. So there's definitely utility. And then we're getting closer to the end here. So I think some guidance for LLM use in writing. There's some papers out there. There's some groups out there who are trying to come up with more consistent guidance and perspectives as well. As we see more utility, there's more guidance coming out. This is one of the areas where we need more consistent recommendations. And I'm not going to talk too much about it. I'm just going to hint that there will be another talk in this series, what we're doing right now, that will discuss guidance for use from synthesis organizations. So I'll leave that to the end of the talk for more information on that. Just from, from some of that literature, the 10 simple rules highlighted in the Smith paper, I think these are good points to end this talk in terms of discussion for writing and the potential uses. It sort of covers all of the major points that I've hit. Um, and, areas of concern. The biggest thing, I think, follow the rules of the target journal. Different journals have different expectations and um, perspectives on the use of LLMs. And you should always outline those relevant risks before LLM use, in your protocol. Being sure to avoid plagiarism and respect confidentiality. That's really important, especially if you have the privilege to work with unpublished data. You really shouldn't use LLMs then, because I think it's unclear just how much information that gets put in as a prompt gets put back into the system in terms of training and availability for other people. There are some closed systems out there that some universities have for use as example. But if you're just using ChatGPT or one of those other models, assume that whatever you put in is something that can be accessed, I think, by other people, or could pop up for other people with the right sort of prompt. So really be careful about confidentiality, and verify the truthfulness of that content that's generated by the LLM. Time and time again, you saw that there were some mistakes that it was making, and that's been found in the literature about search generation and the literature about summarizing the evidence. And that's something that really needs to be considered. This is not a zero shot and one stop approach to fixing and automating systematic reviews. These are tools that we can use to help us do things faster and more efficiently, but they still need our overall guidance and verification. And I think the last point that I wanted to add here, it was, it's mentioned and woven throughout the rules and the text itself, and the other papers, but it wasn't an explicit rule itself. I think it should be rule number 0, transparency. This is the one thing I think everybody can agree on. The importance of transparency in terms of which models you're using, when you're running the models, what prompts you used. That's so important in determining what comes out, how you've used it, and if you have used it for writing, how you've then modified the final product, right? So that you're not just taking exactly what the LLM has given you. So, what comes next? Again, just to reiterate, these are useful as tools, but they're not perfect. There is a need for pre-specification and transparency, and we still need more clarity, I think, on the guidelines and recommendations for future use. They just evolve so quickly. It's something that it is hard to keep up with, and when I search to find any of these sort of topics, there's more and more papers out there all the time on the different aspects of how LLMs can be integrated into systematic reviews. So this is, I think, guidelines, recommendations for moving forward is really where we can focus some of our effort to allow us to then conduct more replicability and benchmarking studies, further assess the abilities and capabilities of systematic reviews. Thank you.